Alright, historians, today we're going to look at World War II, and this is from chapter 23 in your book. And as you can see, we're going to back up a little bit to 1933 all the way to 1945 in this chapter. So not as intense as the other chapters, not covering like several decades at a time, going a little bit slower and getting a little bit more in-depth, but not a ton of depth to World War II. So in this section, in this chapter, the sections that we're going to cover are the road to war, as you can see from this slide, the home front economy, fighting for equality at home, and then global war. So let's get started talking about the road toward war. So although the League of Nations debacle at the end of World War I signaled a measure of isolationism in specifically U.S. politics, the United States does continue to engage in international affairs. We signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war and national policy. We also expanded our foreign investments throughout the world and opened up diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1933. The U.S. also embraced a form of isolationism that rejected participation in international organizations, such as the League of Nations. And if you'll go back and recall, the reason that it didn't pass with the Republicans is because it was like this collective approach to foreign policy. You had to go through the League of Nations when you were conducting foreign affairs, and that really worried Republicans at the time, and that's why they didn't want to be a part of the League of Nations. And also, not just the League of Nations, but the World Court and anti-war sentiments proliferated in popular culture and also in literature. Then in 1934, the Senate began investigating bankers and munition makers, labeling them merchants of death for pushing the United States to war in 1917. We actually have hearings. We are going to Senate investigations and Senate hearings. Those hearings were headed by Senator Gerald Nye, and they appealed to the spreading isolationism and the anti-business mood in the midst of the Depression. From 1935 through 1937, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts in an effort to create barriers to U.S. involvement in European wars. The acts prohibited private loans or the sale of munitions to belligerent nations. Belligerent means nations that are at war with each other, and required belligerents, nations at war, to pay cash for non-military purchases and ship them on their own vessels. So this isolationism just means that we're going to isolate ourselves even more and try to stay out of foreign affairs and foreign politics and foreign wars, which sounds really good, right? Like that's kind of a good thing, and play both sides. We're going to try to stay neutral and make money off of both sides when they're in war. But at the same time, those neutrality acts technically not supposed to be selling anything to nations that are at war. So we'll see how that's going to play out. There we go. In 1933, a guy you've all heard this name, Adolf Hitler, he rose to power in Germany, and he installed National Socialism, what we also refer to as Nazism, at home while striving to create the empire of the Third Reich, abroad as part of his mission to rebuild German global power. After World War I, and economic despair had devastated and demoralized Germany. In 1936, Hitler sent troops to the Rhineland between Germany and France, and in 1938, he pushed Austria to unite with Germany, and with Great Britain and France's approval, he annexed the western part of Czechoslovakia. Germany was unopposed when it moved to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939. So we're going to shift and we're going to go to another part of the world, not very far from Germany. Over in Italy in 1935, they're being led by what we consider a dictator. Mussolini is his name, and he invaded the independent African nation of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was one of the few nations in Africa to not be colonized by Europe, a European nation. They remained independent. Part of that is because they're one of the few African nations that practice Christianity. So overthrowing their emperor in Ethiopia, Italy is going to take over. Then in 1936, Italy and Germany offered support to General Francisco Franco in his effort to overthrow Spain's democratically elected socialist government. As the Spanish Civil War erupted, this is in the late 1930s, the United States maintained its neutrality, though some left-leaning Americans volunteered to fight with the Spanish loyalists as part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and others offered financial support for the Loyalist government. In 1939, Franco's forces were victorious. So even before World War II breaks out, you can see all these shifting and moving and, Germany taking over and annexing parts of Europe, Italy doing the same to Africa, and then Spain is involved in their own civil war. A lot of conflict happening in Europe. Here we go. So most Americans were very wary of U.S. involvement in any of those European conflicts, but we're going to have a new president. You've probably heard of him, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He understood that the United States would need to remain engaged in world affairs in spite of the Neutrality Acts. So war formally broke out in Europe when Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. Britain and France promptly declared war on Germany and Italy, but the Soviet Union, they had just signed this non-aggression pact with Germany, and that was a move on part of Joseph Stalin to delay direct conflict with Hitler, who would break the pact in June of 1941. So this pact was essentially like, okay, we see you, Soviet Union, we're German, we see you, we're not going to mess with you with this non-aggression act. We promise not to invade or try to take over your country, but then Hitler's going to renege on that, and he actually will try to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. President Roosevelt, the President of the United States, he publicly maintained U.S. neutrality, but he acknowledged that most Americans would embrace probably the Allied side. By 1940, Germany had ratcheted up in its aggression, launching their Lightning War across Europe after conquering Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. As German victories mounted, opponents to American involvement in the war formed the America First Committee. You've probably heard of this during the Trump era. This came back when Trump was in office. But this organization utilized the concern felt by many Americans about getting dragged into another European war. We're going to put ourselves first. We don't care about war crimes. We don't care about what you're doing to Jewish people. We don't care about what you're doing to undesirable people. We come first, and we're not worried about any other nation. It's part of that isolationism movement that was, throughout the U.S. at the time. This is a picture of the America First rally. This is in 1941. Just take a look at who is there. You can still see that this is a very segregated time. You don't see any minorities in this picture. Just wanted to point that out. The commitment of isolationists was tested when France fell to German control in 1940. The British then endured a bombing campaign on London and other targets by the Germans. The Battle of Britain put the effort to maintain neutrality in the United States on increasingly shaky ground. In the wake of France's defeat, the vast majority of Americans supported some degree of the aid to the Allies while opposing the United States' immediate entry into the war. So we want to help our allies, but we want to try to stay out of it as much as we can. We don't want to put soldiers on the ground. This is essentially what the United States is trying to avoid. We'll send money, we'll send supplies if you need it, but we don't want to send our soldiers just yet. Roosevelt, he responded by arguing that offering assistance to Britain was a way to prevent U.S. military, so like sending that aid that they need. Between September 1940 and November of 1941, almost like over a year, the United States offered significant aid to Britain, including the provision of destroyers in exchange for leases on British naval bases in the Western Hemisphere, a transaction that really helped boost British morale. So it's that aid offered to Britain. On September 16, 1940, the U.S. government enacted its first peacetime draft through the Selective Service Act, which registered more than 16 million men. At the same time, Roosevelt promised constituents during his 1940 campaign against Wendell Willkie that your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war. That's a quote from Roosevelt. In March of 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, number 10 up there, which authorized the lending or leasing of military and other equipment to Britain to protect British ships carrying those supplies. The United States increased its defensive measures and began patrolling the North Atlantic by air and water. By the middle of 1941, the United States and Germany were engaged in an unofficial but full-fledged naval war. We call that a quasi-war. In August of 1941, Roosevelt and the Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill, signed the Atlantic Charter, which advocated free trade, self-determination, freedom of the seas, and, quote, freedom from fear and want, unquote. Roosevelt also promised to protect certain parts of the North Atlantic until a crisis came that allowed the United States to intervene more fully. After several German U-boats attacked U.S. ships later that year, Congress repealed the Neutrality Acts. The United States had turned its attention to events across the Atlantic, but across the Pacific, U.S. relations with Japan had gradually begun to deteriorate. And that happened because in 1931, Japan invaded part of mainland Asia, this area called Manchuria. And after Japanese forces moved further into China in 1937, the United States began supplying China with arms, with weapons. In 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. Then they invaded Indochina and faced increasing conflict with the United States. So this treaty that they signed with Germany and Italy, number 4 up there, it's between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Basically, if one nation shows aggression towards any of those 3, then you face all 3. So number 5 there, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and Congress then allows us to declare war on Japan because of that treaty that Japan has signed, the United States declares war on Japan, but guess who's going to fight on behalf of Japan? Germany and Italy. So now we've entered into the war when we declare war on Japan. That deteriorating part, between the relationship between Japan and the United States, it erupted on December 7th, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing more than 2,400 Americans and destroying battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and almost 200 planes. So they attacked Pearl Harbor. There's also an airfield. The Air Force was not established yet, but they do have like an airfield in Hawaii called Hickam Airfield. It's now Hickam Air Force Base, but they also took out the runways and a lot of the planes at the airfield, so they couldn't get the planes up to fight the Japanese planes. So on December 8th of 1941, though, Congress, they voted to declare war on Japan. And on December 11th, a few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States because we had declared war on Japan, their ally. And that rapidly ended U.S. isolationism and entering the United States into a full-scale world war. Here's a picture, just in case you guys, I always like to put faces with names sometimes. And so this is Roosevelt here on the left, and this is the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England. So let's talk about the home front economy. So war mobilization, that's what's going to help bring us out of the Great Depression in the United States, as 3.8 million workers were added to the federal government, and national budget, the gross national product, union membership rolls, and enlistment in the armed forces skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. The United States was consumed by economic growth, with auto factories, rubber companies, oil refineries, steel mills, and textile and shoe factories all providing supplies to fight or furnish the war. Americans moved about the country to participate in war industries, and all regions boomed as they specialized in various aspects of war production. The South, for example, saw an influx of federal money to support military camps. Here in Paris, that's when Camp Maxi was built, was during the war. Textile industries that produced uniforms also are going to help in the South, and then port cities in the South where battleships were built and launched were also established. The West Coast, this is like California, Washington, Oregon, they provided access to the Pacific and thus became increasing strategic importance to the nation, fueling the growth of airplane plants and shipyards in Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. Congress gave the president the authority to reorganize any government agency as he saw fit for the sake of the war effort, and in 1942, President Roosevelt created the War Production Board to manage the economy. This is domestic product of the great powers. So you have the United States, the USSR, Germany and Austria, Great Britain, Japan, Italy, and France. And so you kind of see everyone else is kind of down here, but you can tell when we really ramped up how much, money we're pouring into it. This is billions of dollars, and these are 1990s prices. So you can tell we have a lot of money being poured in, a lot of money being used, a lot of domestic product going out and being made. So we really cranked up production. The board offered incentives to businesses for supporting war industry, including lower tax rates, assistance with cost, and the promise of increased revenue and corporate net profits doubling during the war. In the first part of the war, American factories grew exponentially, supplying over half the world's manufactured goods and demonstrating the possibilities for rapid production, with plants completing a ship each day and an airplane every 5 minutes. Government spending in World War II amounted to more than $320 billion, sourced by war bonds, increased tax rates across income brackets, and inflation, all of which had an impact on the financial well-being of ordinary Americans. By the end of the war, more than 12 million men and women either had enlisted or were drafted to serve in the war, a dramatic increase from just 250,000 military members in 1940. The diversity of the military reflected the diversity of the American population, as the U.S. Armed Forces included men from recent immigrant families, Americans with deep roots in the United States, gay men, and African Americans who confronted a segregated military. Women joined the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, and the Women's Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, known as the WAVES, in droves. Women in these other service branches perform clerical, medical, and transportation duties. The growth of the military created a labor shortage that fueled union membership and led Roosevelt to organize the National War Labor Board, which regulated labor conditions and authorized the government to step in at plants that did not comply with the board's decisions. Congress responded to a small spike in strikes in 1943 by passing the Smith-Connolly Act, which established a 30-day cooling off period before unions could strike and forbade workers from walking out of defense industries. These are super famous men, the Tuskegee Airmen. And what's really cool is you can see some of the autographs from these men. If you don't know anything about this, just do a Google search and you'll spend, you could spend hours reading about them or just a few minutes just to familiarize yourself with more about the contribution that these men made to the war effort. Women also found many new work opportunities in the war years, particularly in fields formerly dominated by men, whose absence from the labor force fostered a 141% growth in the number of women working in manufacturing and a 436% growth in the number of women working in war industries. Women saw increased wages as industry jobs paid better than clerical sales and service jobs, and the number of women who worked in the traditionally low-paying field of domestic service, that's going to drop by 20% because they're all moving from that domestic service into something a little bit higher up on the pay scale. Older women were more likely to join the workforce than women with young children, for whom the government did little to provide child care for. Women who did find manufacturing work still made lower wages than men and were less likely to be promoted. Though the image of the strong and forceful Rosie the Riveter dominated popular representations of working women, most employers pitched jobs to women by comparing the work to household labor, and most women were viewed by employers as only temporary employees. Here's some propaganda for you. Women workers during the war is what this is titled, but women in the war, we can't win without them. And it's showing something that would probably be a traditionally male job, showing a woman working, and also trying to entice women to get into the workforce to help with the war effort. But what about everyday life on the home front? Well, the government established the Office of War Information, which, like the Committee on Public Information during World War I, promoted the war effort across American society. The domestic war effort included collecting scrap metal and rubber in schools, planting victory gardens at home, so you plant your own and grow your own vegetables and fruits so that you don't have to go to the store, because that, like on the big farms that sell to those local markets and grocery stores, that food needs to be going overseas or to the military camps for the military. So these victory gardens, you plant those and grow your own produce. Running social events as fundraisers and rationing gasoline, meat, butter, and sugar. Films highlighted particular aspects of war, portraying American servicemen as heroes. Mission to Moscow, it came out in 1943, and Casablanca in 1942, offered audiences an opportunity to explore the theme of war through personal, political, and a social lens. At home, family life shifted. Many Americans moved during the war, and with more mothers and fathers working outside the home, children became what were known as latchkey kids because they would wear a key around their neck on a necklace that was the key to their home so they could get in if mom wasn't home because she was still at work. But these latchkey kids, we saw this rise in juvenile delinquency because no one was there to look after them. As the war wound down in 1945, the birth rate is also going to increase dramatically, signaling the start of what you guys refer to as the boomers, or the baby boom. This is called the origins of the civil rights movement. It actually started way before this. It started in the early 1900s, but there is a lot of debate on when it actually started. So we'll say okay to the book with the origins of the civil rights movement. It's saying in 1941. I would argue that it started really with the creation of the NAACP in the early 1900s, but that's my own personal opinion as a historian. But in June of 1941, longtime labor leader A. Philip Randolph announced that he would lead 100,000 African Americans in marching on Washington, D.C. to protest segregation and discrimination in war industries and the military. President Roosevelt feared that by calling attention to segregation and racism at home, the march would embarrass U.S. forces fighting for democracy and freedom overseas, so he arranged a meeting with Randolph. The two worked out a compromise. In exchange for Randolph calling off the march, the president issued Executive Order 8802, establishing the Fair Employment Practice Committee, FEPC, which banned job discrimination in war industries and, in spite of its limited effectiveness, provided African Americans with job opportunities. Roosevelt refused to order the desegregation of the military, however. Black leaders used the context of the war to inaugurate the Double V campaign, signifying the fight to achieve victory over racism at home and abroad, and civil rights organizers saw some important triumphs during the war years. In 1944, the NAACP's legal maneuvers led to the victory of the Supreme Court case, Smith v. Allwright, which outlawed all white Democratic primaries in the South, and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, established in Chicago in 1942, initiated sit-in protests at places that refused to serve black customers. The efforts made by African Americans in war foreshadowed the surge in civil rights activity that was to come in the 1950s and 60s. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the rural South to the urban South and North and the West, where they faced continuing employment discrimination, housing discrimination, also known as redlining, and violence. In 1943, more than 240 race riots took place, including one right here in Paris, Texas, one in Detroit that resulted in 34 deaths. You've got the race riots in Chicago and Harlem and Los Angeles. They're all over the place. There's a really infamous one in Beaumont, Texas as well. Wartime brought an influx of immigrants in from Mexico, and in 1942, the U.S. government made an agreement with Mexico to hire contract laborers, or braceros, to work in agricultural and industries. Mexican Americans served in the armed forces and worked in war industries, and the context of war elevated their consciousness in the area of civil rights, inspiring Ignacio Lopez to campaign for the desegregation of movie theaters, pools, and other public accommodations. Lopez's movement inspired boycotts against discriminatory companies and led to the creation of the Unity Leagues in Texas. Middle-class Mexican Americans formed the League of United Latin American Citizens, called LULAC, which performed to launch boycotts only after negotiations to end discriminatory practices had failed. In Los Angeles, a small number of Mexican American teenagers, frustrated with the discrimination and hostility, identified themselves as gang members by wearing zoot suits. These were loose-fitting jackets with these really padded shoulders and baggy pants, along with wide-brimmed hats, pocket watches on chains, and slick-back hair. On June 4, 1943, squads of sailors invaded Mexican-American neighborhoods in East Los Angeles and attacked whomever they encountered, including zoot suiters. Police arrested Mexican Americans who tried to fight back, and the zoot suit riots lasted for 4 days. And guess who was held accountable? Not the ones who started it, but the zoot suit guys. They were the ones held responsible. That was not their fight. They didn't start it, but they are the ones that are going to be blamed for it. American Indians also played a large role in the American war effort. More than 25,000 Indians served in the military during the war. Probably the most infamous, and hopefully you've heard of, the Navajo Code Talkers. They were soldiers, and they were very critical in the Pacific Theater, where they worked to confuse and mislead Japanese intelligence efforts by sending coded messages in their tribal language. No one could decipher the Navajo language. Many Indians left the reservation at this time, finding positions and opportunity in defense-related industries. Here's some of the Navajo Code Talkers. There's really a movie, a really good movie. It has Nicolas Cage in it, but it's called Wind Talkers, I believe. But it's about these men who served during World War II. If you have a chance, watch it sometime. In the context of World War II, Japanese Americans faced much greater discrimination from ordinary Americans and the government than did Italian Americans and German Americans, who had generally assimilated into the wider population after World War I. You can't really tell who's German and who's Italian when you line them up with a bunch of other white people, right? But you can tell who's Asian. You can tell who is African American. Those are easy to spot. So the government did put 250 Italians and 11,000 Germans, including some American citizens, into internment camps, but those numbers were very minuscule compared to the number of Japanese Americans who were put in internment camps. Most people of Japanese descent in the United States, they lived along the West Coast. Think about why they would live along the West Coast. And the government removed all of them, whether or not they were citizens, to camps in Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Idaho, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming. In Hawaii, people of Japanese descent, they ended up living under martial law, military law. More than 100,000 people of Japanese descent, the majority of them who were American citizens, were moved to internment camps for the duration of the war. They had no civil rights, and they had no constitutional protections, all because white Americans believed that Japanese Americans could not be trusted. Japanese Americans sold, rented, or abandoned their homes and businesses and brought with them only what they could carry. Making the best of their situation in camps, they attempted to continue to educate and entertain themselves and to worship as best they could. Some of those who were interned formed community associations, produced artwork, or wrote about their experiences, and in spite of their situation, some 18,000 Japanese American men joined the army and fought in Europe, many of them serving in the 442nd Regiment, which was among the first units to liberate concentration camps. Fred Korematsu was one of many Japanese Americans to fight their internment through the courts. In 1944, after the Supreme Court had denied his appeal, Roosevelt rescinded the order mandating internment. In contrast to Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans saw their situation improve in wartime. With the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943, Chinese American soldiers fought in integrated military units and worked in integrated war industries. Most Japanese Americans returned to their communities at the end of the war and continued to work hard at jobs and remain loyal American citizens. However, about 8,000 Japanese Americans renounced their U.S. citizenship and moved back to Japan in 1945. And can you blame them? Probably not. In 1988, Congress awarded $20,000 in reparations to each of the 60,000 living internees. 10 years later, President Bill Clinton awarded Fred Korematsu the Presidential Medal of Freedom. All right, global war. So this war in Europe. Let's shift back over to the war front. The United States joined the Grand Alliance with Britain, the Soviet Union, and the French government in exile, but the various factions within the alliance disagreed about how to dismantle Germany's military. The Soviet Union promoted the opening of a second front in Western Europe to defuse German aggression, while Great Britain wanted to focus on pushing the Germans back in North Africa and Southern Europe to protect its own colonial power. Roosevelt understood the Soviets' demands, but voted to postpone an invasion of France to 1943 in favor of chipping away at German power on the edge of Europe. In 1942, the Allies' strategies began to work as they pushed the Germans out of Egypt, and after a series of battles in Algeria and Morocco, out of Africa altogether by 1943. The Soviet Union had held German forces back at Stalingrad, but still needed a second front in France in order to protect its own interest. Roosevelt pushed the invasion of France back to 1944, exacerbating tensions between the Soviets and the other Allies. British, American, and Canadian troops invaded Italy in July of 1943, and Mussolini was quickly removed from power. It was not until June 1944, however, that the Allies finally occupied Rome and pushed the Germans out of central Italy. To appease Stalin, without opening an immediate second front, Roosevelt extended the Lend-Lease program to the Soviet Union, and in November 1943, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met in Tehran, Iran, and mapped out war strategies. Soviet forces would enter the fight against Japan after the European War ended. The Second Front would open within 6 months, and an international organization to promote peace would be established at war's end. On June 6 of 1944, also known as D-Day, General Dwight D. Eisenhower led 1.5 million American, British, and Canadian troops across the English Channel for an invasion of France at Normandy. By August of that year, the Allies had liberated Paris, France, and by late 1944, they had regained total control of France and parts of Belgium. In the wake of the Allied military success, Roosevelt easily won a 4th presidential term, with Harry S. Truman of Missouri as his new vice president. So here's just all those places that we just talked about. In France here's Paris. This is D-Day invasion where they came in on the beaches of Normandy, the Battle of Britain. So you can kind of see how close everything is over here, right? We're kind of not used to that in the United States where we have, you can drive across our entire country and you drive through all these different states. It's kind of like driving through Europe. You drive through all these different countries, right? So here's the part of North Africa that they were talking about. And then, of course, here you can also tell, like, the Axis powers, who we kind of associate with the bad guys. Those are in brown, and then controlled by the Axis powers are in yellow. So you can tell they have a lot of control of the European continent. Neutral nations like Portugal and Spain and Turkey are there in the brown. And then the Allied powers, who we are allied ourselves with, you have Great Britain, the Soviet Union, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, those areas. So in 1942, we're going to switch over and we're going to go to the Pacific Theater. In 1942, U.S. forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur and Curtis LeMay and Admiral Chester Nimitz began a campaign to liberate Japanese-occupied islands in the Pacific. The Allies saw victories in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway Island, at Guadalcanal Island, in the Mariana Islands, and eventually in the Philippines. And by 1945, they were poised for a major battle with Japan. U.S. Marines won significant victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but suffered significant losses, as the Japanese demonstrated their intention to fiercely defend their homeland. The U.S. Army Air Corps firebombed Tokyo, killing about 330,000 Japanese civilians in an attempt to decimate the Japanese economy and ruin the nation's ability to sustain war. Standing firm in the face of both the firebombing and a blockade that prevented supplies, food, and medicine from entering the country, the Japanese retaliated by sending kamikaze pilots to crash planes into American ships and planes. So kamikaze pilots, it's a one-way flight. They're going to crash in, they're going to go down with the plane. We do see a lot of kamikaze pilots flying into battleships and trying to create as much damage as they can. And so they're suicide pilots, essentially. They will eventually have suicide torpedoes also. It's a one-man torpedo that the Japanese are going to start using. Like I said, it's a one-way trip on those for the Japanese. Here's some U.S. soldiers, the Marine Corps fighting. And then this is a map of the Pacific Theater. So you can see the area under Japanese control there in the red. So that was a part of the mainland Manchuria that the Japanese invaded that we talked about at the beginning of the chapter, just to give you an idea. They were going to take over Korea, parts of China like Beijing and Thailand, the Philippine Islands. So you can see this area. And then also I do like how they show you where we are going to drop the atomic bombs. Hiroshima, August 6th, and Nagasaki, August 9th, and we'll talk about those in just a second. But by 1945, the Allies had made the significant headway in both the European and Pacific theaters and needed to create a plan for the post-war world. But a number of significant questions remained. In February of 1945, to try to help answer some of those questions, the Allies crafted the Yalta Agreement, which laid the groundwork for free elections in Eastern Europe, but the Soviet Union, which had been invaded, through Poland at the outset of both world wars was frustrated with the agreement. The Allies remained committed to the establishment of the United Nations, and they reached a tentative agreement to divide post-war Germany into U.S., British, French, and Soviet zones. So we are going to see Germany divided up into 4 different zones controlled by those 4 world powers. In mid-December of 1944, the Germans made one last effort to save their cause, launching the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies pushed the Germans into retreat across the Rhine River, resulting in a series of events that led to the fall of Berlin and a German surrender on May 7th. Even as the Allies were closing in on victory in Europe, the United States remained focused on achieving a quick victory in Japan and had the potential to do so with the development of the atomic bomb. In 1942, a group of U.S. scientists and engineers led by Robert Oppenheimer began developing an atomic bomb. Congress spent $2 billion on the so-called Manhattan Project without knowing really what the project entailed. They had no idea what was going on when they agreed to fund this project. Harry Truman, he didn't even know. He was the vice president, but he learned about the bomb after he assumed the presidency following Roosevelt's death in April of 1945. He warned the Japanese that they faced annihilation if they did not surrender, and the Japanese agreed to comply on the condition that they could keep their emperor, Hirohito. The United States refused to accept anything less than unconditional surrender. And on August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, instantly killing 80,000 civilians and imposing death by radiation poisoning on tens of thousands more. On August 9th, still Japan does not surrender. So 3 days later, on August 9th, the United States dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, killing 100,000, and on August 14th, Japan agreed to surrender. Most Americans supported the decision to use the atomic bomb, and Truman argued that Roosevelt probably would have done so, that the decision would save American lives, and that the attack served as retribution for the attack on Pearl Harbor and for Japanese wartime atrocities. There's the other side of the argument too, and some of you who are going to be writing about this, think about the other side of the argument. We could have probably won the war. It would have cost more American lives, but we could have won the war more than likely without dropping an atomic bomb. Try to look at both sides of the argument and figure out what you think is best. Should we have dropped it or should we not have dropped it? You probably have seen these pictures before. These are pictures of Holocaust survivors. So we're going to talk about that kind of to end things. In the process of overthrowing Nazi rule in Germany and Poland, Allied forces saw firsthand the extent of Nazi concentration camps designed to exterminate or work to death 11 million Jews, Slavs, Poles, Gypsies, homosexuals, disabled people, and communists. The camps were filled with mass graves, crematoria, and survivors who had barely staved off death from starvation, as we just saw in that picture. Despite the fact that reports of camps had trickled out of Germany since early in the war, Americans were shocked at the revelation of the Holocaust. Earlier in the war, Roosevelt had turned a blind eye to the atrocities, fearing the military risk and the danger to inmates if an attempt to liberate the camps was made too soon. Basically, Roosevelt knew what was going on. He had seen reports of it. At first, they thought it was just war propaganda. They didn't think it was real. They thought that was something to have us join the war early and go ahead and invade. But Roosevelt makes the decision, although he knows what's going on, he makes the decision not to send in the military because he thought, we would lose military personnel, and also anyone that was alive in those camps, he was afraid they would be immediately exterminated if they heard about U.S. troops coming. So failing to loosen immigration laws also to accommodate a greater influx of Jews trying to leave, trying to get out, and other persecuted minorities from Europe, the United States, we only offered asylum to about 21,000 people. They were trying to get in, trying to come to the U.S. to escape extermination, and we only allowed a very small fraction to come in. And that really reflected the widespread anti-Semitism in the State Department. That's why we don't let a whole bunch of people in, because they didn't like Jewish people. Here's a picture of Hiroshima. This is the last bomb that we dropped. And this was the one where Japan is going to finally surrender. So when we start talking about chapter 24, we're going to talk about how we rebuild not only, places in Japan. We're not going to focus too much on Japan, but we're going to talk about rebuilding Europe after World War II. And this beef that we kind of briefly talked about between the Soviet Union and the United States, hopefully you can find that in this chapter. But we're going to talk about that beef and how it grows and how it catapults us into what's known as the Cold War.